December 7th, 1941. The morning sun rises over Pearl Harbor, casting long shadows across Battleship Row. The waters are calm, shallow, deceptively peaceful. Sailors are waking up. Some are having breakfast. Others are preparing for morning colors. The daily ceremony of raising the flag. It's Sunday, a day of rest. But beneath this tranquility, beneath the routine of naval life, lies a problem that should have made this harbor nearly invulnerable to one of warfare's deadliest weapons, the aerial torpedo. American strategists had studied Pearl Harbor's geography carefully. They had measured its depths, they had calculated the odds, and they had come to a reassuring conclusion. Pearl Harbor was too shallow for torpedo attacks. The physics simply didn't work. The Japanese knew it too. They understood the problem perfectly. They had run the same calculations. They had reached the same conclusions. But they didn't stop there. For years, in secret, Japanese naval engineers had been working on a puzzle that would change the course of history, a puzzle they would solve with one of the most elegant innovations in the history of naval warfare: a piece of wood. To understand what the Japanese achieved, we need to understand the weapon itself, the torpedo. By 1941, the aerial torpedo had become one of the most feared weapons in naval warfare. Imagine, a weapon that could be delivered by aircraft, that could travel underwater at high speed, that could punch through the armor of the mightiest battleship. It was revolutionary. The concept was elegant. A plane would fly low over the water, release its torpedo, and the weapon would enter the sea, propel itself toward the target, and detonate against the hull below the waterline, where ships were most vulnerable. But there was a catch, a significant catch that would determine the fate of Pearl Harbor. When an aerial torpedo was released from an aircraft, it didn't just slip gracefully into the water and immediately level out. Physics doesn't work that way. The torpedo would drop from the plane, fall through the air, then slam into the water with tremendous force, and then it would plunge. Deep, sometimes 90 feet deep, sometimes even more. The momentum from the fall, combined with the weight of the weapon, would drive it down into the depths before its internal mechanisms could stabilize it and bring it back up to attack depth. This was acceptable in deep water. In the open ocean, a torpedo could plunge 100 feet and still have plenty of room to level out and find its target. But in shallow water, this was a fatal flaw. Now, let's talk about Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, is a natural harbor. It's sheltered, protected, and crucially, it's shallow. The water depth across most of the harbor averages around 45 feet. 45 feet! Think about that for a moment. A standard torpedo plunges 90 feet. The harbor is only 45 feet deep. Do the math. Any conventional torpedo dropped in Pearl Harbor would simply bury itself in the mud at the bottom. It would drive nose first into the silt and sediment, and there it would stay, buried, unexploded, useless. American naval planners knew this. They had studied the problem thoroughly. They understood the physics, and they took comfort in it. Pearl Harbor's shallow waters were seen as a natural defense, a geological shield. Torpedo attacks? Impossible. The Japanese could send their aircraft, but without effective torpedoes, the damage would be limited to bombs. And bombs, while dangerous, were far less effective against armored battleships than torpedoes striking below the waterline. It was a reasonable assumption, based on solid physics. But assumptions, even reasonable ones, can be deadly in war. 6,000 miles away in Japan, naval planners were facing a dilemma. If war came with the United States, and increasingly it seemed that war was inevitable, the Japanese Navy would need to strike first, hard, decisively. They would need to cripple the American Pacific Fleet before it could respond. And where was the American Pacific Fleet stationed? Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had excellent intelligence about Pearl Harbor. They knew its layout. They knew where the ships were moored. They knew the routines, the defenses, the vulnerabilities. But they also knew about the shallow water. In the mid-1930s, as tensions between Japan and the United States began to escalate, Japanese naval aviation experts started seriously studying the problem of shallow water torpedo attacks. They looked at harbors around the world. They analyzed depths. They calculated trajectories. And they came to an unavoidable conclusion. If they wanted to attack Pearl Harbor effectively, if they wanted to use torpedoes, they would need to innovate. They would need to create something new. The weapon they had was the Type 91 aerial torpedo. It was a good weapon, reliable, powerful. It had been introduced in 1931 and had been continuously improved over the years. By the late 1930s, it was one of the most advanced aerial torpedoes in the world. But like all torpedoes of its time, it dove too deep. The Japanese engineers understood the challenge before them. They needed to make a torpedo that would enter the water and immediately level out. They needed to eliminate that deadly plunge that would send their weapons into the mud. How do you do that? How do you change the fundamental physics of a torpedo's water entry? The answer they developed, over years of testing and refinement, was both brilliantly simple and remarkably sophisticated. The solution came down to one critical insight. The problem wasn't what happened after the torpedo entered the water. The torpedo's internal mechanisms, its gyroscopes, its depth controls, its propulsion system, those were already excellent. The problem was the entry itself. When a torpedo drops from an aircraft, it falls through the air. And during that fall, it can tumble, it can roll, it can enter the water at the wrong angle. If it hits the water nose down at a steep angle, it will plunge deep. That's basic physics. But what if you could control the torpedo during its fall? What if you could keep it perfectly stable, perfectly oriented, so that it would enter the water at exactly the right angle? Nose slightly up, ready to level out immediately. That was the key. And the solution, the elegant, simple, brilliant solution, was wood. Large wooden stabilizer fins. The Japanese engineers designed special wooden attachments that would be fitted to the tail section of the Type 91 torpedo. These weren't crude additions. They were precision-engineered aerodynamic controls. Each one was carefully shaped, carefully balanced, carefully positioned. Here's how they worked. During the fall from the aircraft, these wooden fins acted as aerodynamic stabilizers. They caught the air. They created drag. They prevented the torpedo from rolling or tumbling. Think of them like the feathers on an arrow. They kept the torpedo flying straight and true during its brief journey through the air. But they did something more sophisticated than that. The wooden fins were designed to work in conjunction with the torpedo's internal gyroscopic system. The Type 91 had an advanced angular acceleration control system, essentially a primitive but effective form of what we would today call a PID controller. This system used gyroscopes to detect and correct rolling motion. The wooden fins enhanced this system. They acted as gyroscopically driven ailerons. They responded to the torpedo's internal corrections, amplifying them, making the stabilization even more effective. The result? A torpedo that fell through the air with perfect stability. No roll, no tumble, just a straight controlled descent. And that meant when the torpedo hit the water, it would hit at exactly the right angle. Nose slightly elevated, ready to skim. But here's where the design becomes truly brilliant. Those wooden fins, they needed to be there during the fall. They were essential for the aerodynamic stability. But once the torpedo entered the water, they became a liability. They would create drag. They would interfere with the torpedo's underwater performance. So the Japanese engineers designed them to fail, deliberately. The wooden fins were attached in such a way that they would shear off upon impact with the water. The force of hitting the surface, remember, these torpedoes were being dropped at high speed, would cleanly break the wooden components away from the torpedo body. The wood would splinter, break away, sink harmlessly to the bottom, and the torpedo, freed from its wooden guides, would continue on its mission. But now it would be in the water at the perfect angle, with the perfect orientation, ready to level out immediately. The modified Type 91 could run at a depth of just 20 meters. 20 meters, about 65 feet. In Pearl Harbor's 45-foot depths, that was shallow enough. But the innovation didn't stop with just the large tail stabilizers. The Japanese engineers were thorough, obsessive. They added multiple wooden components to the torpedo. Smaller wooden fins were placed near the front of the tail cone. These provided additional roll stability. They ensured that during the critical moment of water entry, the torpedo maintained perfect orientation. Wooden sheaths were slipped over the torpedo's side anti-roll tabs. These tabs were part of the torpedo's normal design, but for shallow water operations, they needed additional protection and enhanced function during the air-to-water transition. Every wooden component was calculated. Every attachment point was tested. The Japanese left nothing to chance. Why wood? It's a question worth considering. This was 1940. The Japanese had access to advanced metals. They could have fabricated complex mechanical systems. Why use something as simple as wood? Because wood was perfect for the job. First, it was lightweight. The wooden fins didn't significantly change the torpedo's weight or balance. The aircraft could carry them without performance penalties. The torpedo could be handled and loaded using existing equipment and procedures. Second, wood was aerodynamically effective. It could be shaped precisely. It could be sanded and refined until it produced exactly the airflow characteristics needed. It worked. Third, and this is crucial, wood was designed to fail in exactly the right way. When the torpedo hit the water, the wooden components needed to break away cleanly. Metal might bend. Plastic might deform. But wood? Wood would splinter cleanly, breaking at predetermined stress points, separating from the torpedo without causing damage. Fourth, wood was inexpensive. Japan was preparing for war. They would need hundreds of these modified torpedoes. Wooden components could be manufactured quickly, cheaply, in large quantities. Local craftsmen could be trained to produce them. The supply chain was simple. And finally, wood was disposable. These were one-time use components. They didn't need to be recovered. They didn't need to survive the water impact. They just needed to work once. Perfectly. Innovation is one thing. Making it work reliably under combat conditions, that's something else entirely. The Japanese tested their modified torpedoes extensively, drop after drop after drop. They conducted tests in Kagoshima Bay, which had depths similar to Pearl Harbor. They experimented with every variable they could control. Drop altitude. They tried different heights. Too high, and the torpedo would gain too much speed, hitting the water too hard. Too low, and the pilots would be dangerously exposed to anti-aircraft fire. They settled on 66 feet as optimal. That was double the altitude required for older torpedo designs, a significant operational advantage. Pilots could stay higher, stay safer. Drop speed. They experimented with different aircraft speeds during torpedo release. Too fast, and the torpedo's entry would be too violent. Too slow, and the aircraft would be vulnerable. They determined that 160 knots or less was ideal. Entry angle. They measured the angle of the aircraft relative to the water. They calculated the trajectory. They refined the wooden fin designs to produce exactly the right orientation at the moment of water entry. Water depth. They dropped torpedoes in different depths. They recovered them. They examined them for damage. They measured how deep they went before leveling out. Again and again and again. Each test produced data. Each drop revealed something new. The engineers would take the information, refine their designs, adjust their procedures, and test again. This wasn't guesswork. This was systematic engineering at its finest. By 1941, they had perfected the system. The wooden fins were precisely shaped. The attachment points were reliable. The breakaway mechanism worked consistently. The torpedoes performed exactly as designed. The modified Type 91 was the most effective shallow-water aerial torpedo in the world. No other Navy had anything like it. The Americans certainly didn't. In fact, American torpedo technology at the start of the war was notoriously problematic. American torpedoes had issues with their depth control, with their detonators, with their guidance systems. It would take years for the United States to solve these problems. But the Japanese, their torpedoes were superbly crafted, meticulously maintained. And now, with the wooden fin modifications, they could operate in waters that should have been impossible. The innovation was complete. Now it needed to be used. November 1941. Relations between Japan and the United States have deteriorated beyond repair. Diplomatic negotiations are failing. Economic sanctions are strangling Japan. The Japanese military high command makes a decision: war is inevitable. And if war is inevitable, Japan must strike first. The target, the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The plan is audacious. 6 aircraft carriers will sail across the Pacific. They will maintain radio silence. They will avoid shipping lanes. They will approach Hawaii undetected. And then they will launch everything they have. The attack force includes different types of aircraft: high-altitude bombers carrying armor-piercing bombs, dive bombers for precision attacks, fighters for air superiority, and torpedo bombers. 40 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers in the first wave, each one carrying a single Type 91 torpedo. Each torpedo fitted with wooden stabilizer fins. The modifications are invisible to casual observation. The wooden components are painted the same color as the torpedo body. They blend in, but they're there, ready to do their job. December 6, 1941. The Japanese Carrier Task Force reaches its launch position, 230 miles north of Oahu. The weather is rough. The seas are high. Launching aircraft from a carrier deck in these conditions is dangerous. But the operation proceeds. December 7th. Dawn. The first wave launches, 183 aircraft. They form up in the pre-dawn darkness, and they head south, toward Pearl Harbor. 7:55 a.m. The first wave arrives over Oahu. The surprise is complete. No alarm has been sounded. The American forces are unprepared. The torpedo bombers go in first. They separate from the main formation. They drop to low altitude. Some approach from the east across the Navy Yard. Others come from the west across the anchorages. They spread out, each pilot selecting his target. These pilots are skilled. They've trained for this mission extensively. They know their aircraft. They know their weapons. They know exactly what to do. The Kates drop lower, 66 feet above the water, 160 knots airspeed. Anti-aircraft fire begins. Tracers arc across the sky, but it's sporadic, disorganized. The Americans are still trying to comprehend what's happening. The first torpedo is released. It drops from its mounting under the aircraft's fuselage. For a moment, it falls freely through the air. The wooden stabilizer fins catch the airflow. They keep the torpedo oriented properly. No tumbling, no rolling, just a smooth, controlled fall. The torpedo hits the water. Splash! The wooden fins shear off as designed. They break away cleanly. The torpedo continues into the water, now guided by its internal systems. It's at the perfect angle. The nose pitches up slightly. The depth control engages. The propeller begins spinning. The torpedo accelerates to 42 knots, and it runs shallow, 20 meters, skimming just below the surface of Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, leaving a wake of bubbles, heading straight for its target, USS Oklahoma, battleship, moored along Battleship Row. The torpedo strikes below the waterline. The warhead detonates. 450 pounds of high explosive. The explosion tears a massive hole in the ship's hull. Water rushes in. Then another torpedo hits. And another. Oklahoma is hit by 4 torpedoes in the first few minutes. The flooding is catastrophic. The ship begins to list. Sailors are trapped below decks. The list increases. And then, Oklahoma capsizes. She rolls over. Her masts drive into the harbor bottom. Her hull is exposed to the sky. Over 400 men are trapped inside. The wooden fins did their job perfectly. Across the harbor, more torpedoes are being launched, each one with its wooden guidance system, each one entering the water at the perfect angle, each one running shallow. USS West Virginia. 7 torpedo hits. The battleship settles to the bottom, only kept from capsizing by quick counterflooding by her crew. USS California. 2 torpedoes. She floods and slowly sinks, settling upright on the harbor floor. USS Nevada tries to make a run for the harbor entrance. She's hit by 1 torpedo, then bombs rain down on her. She has to beach herself to avoid sinking in the channel. The torpedo attack lasts perhaps 15 minutes. 15 minutes. In that time, the shallow-running torpedoes accomplish what American planners thought was impossible. They devastate Battleship Row. They sink or damage every major ship in the harbor. 5 battleships hit by torpedoes. Hundreds of sailors killed. The American Pacific Fleet crippled. All because of wooden fins. In the days and weeks after Pearl Harbor, as salvage crews began working on the sunken ships, they found something curious. Pieces of wood, floating in the water, scattered on the harbor bottom, wooden fragments near the submerged torpedoes. At first, they didn't understand what they were seeing. Why would there be carved wooden pieces near Japanese torpedoes? But as they investigated further, as they recovered intact, unexploded torpedoes and examined them, the truth became clear. The Japanese had solved the shallow water problem. American naval intelligence was stunned. They had believed Pearl Harbor was protected by its shallow depth. They had run the calculations. They knew conventional torpedoes couldn't work there, but they had underestimated Japanese ingenuity. The wooden fin modification became a subject of intense study. American engineers examined the recovered pieces. They analyzed the design. They marveled at the elegance of the solution. It was a lesson in innovation, in thinking beyond conventional wisdom, in refusing to accept limitations. The Japanese had faced an impossible problem, and they had solved it with a piece of wood. Today, when we remember Pearl Harbor, we remember the date, December 7th, 1941, a day of infamy. We remember the surprise, the devastation, the loss of life. Over 2,400 Americans killed. We remember how it brought the United States into World War II, but we often forget the engineering that made it possible. Behind every major event in warfare, there are countless technical decisions, countless innovations, countless solutions to impossible problems. The wooden fins on the Type 91 torpedoes represent something profound about the nature of innovation in warfare. They remind us that sometimes the most sophisticated problems don't require sophisticated solutions. Sometimes genius lies in simplicity. The Japanese engineers could have tried to redesign the entire torpedo. They could have developed complex mechanical systems. They could have pursued elaborate technological solutions. Instead, they attached pieces of wood, precisely shaped wood, carefully positioned wood, wood that would do exactly one job perfectly and then break away. It worked. The wooden fins also remind us about the danger of assumptions in military planning. The Americans assumed Pearl Harbor was safe from torpedo attack. They based this assumption on solid physics and reasonable calculations. But they assumed their enemies would accept the same limitations. They assumed no one would find a solution. That assumption cost them dearly. In war, as in life, the impossible is often just the improbable, waiting for someone clever enough to solve it. waiting for someone persistent enough to test and refine until they find an answer. The Japanese found that answer. For years, in secret, they worked on the problem. They tested, they failed, they learned, they tested again, they refined their designs, they perfected their techniques, and on December 7, 1941, their innovation changed history. Today, Pearl Harbor is peaceful again. The water is still shallow, the sun still rises over Battleship Row. Tourists visit the memorial built over the sunken USS Arizona. The wooden fins are long gone, rotten away, scattered, lost to time, but their impact remains. They remind us that in the history of warfare, in the history of human conflict, victory often comes not from superior numbers or superior courage, but from superior innovation, from solving problems that others consider impossible, from refusing to accept limitations. The wooden secret of Pearl Harbor, a simple solution to a complex problem that changed the world. December 7, 1941, a day of tragedy, a day of loss, a day that tested the American spirit, but also a day that revealed our resilience, our unity, our unwavering commitment to stand together in the face of adversity. We remember Pearl Harbor. We remember the fallen. We honor their sacrifice, and we ensure that their memory lives on, not just in marble and bronze, but in the freedoms we enjoy, the peace we cherish, and the vigilance we maintain. They gave everything. We owe them everything. Rest in peace, heroes of Pearl Harbor. Your watch has ended. Ours continues.